Hello and welcome to the 16th edition of the Mobility Talks, the web series by EIT Urban Mobility. Today, we will be discussing recommendations for the successful deployment of demand-responsive transport. And this discussion comes as a complement to a new report released today by the EIT Urban Mobility precisely on this topic, and you can find it by going to the EIT Urban Mobility website, which is for sure in your favorites. And then you go to news and events, publications, and you can download the report from there. And there does seem to be a lot of interest in this topic. If I just look at the number of registrations for this session, which were above 170, well, what we see is something actually quite astonishing, is that attendees are joining from 43 different countries, which I think is a measure of the interest in this issue globally. Now, as usual with our mobility talks, we try and make these sessions as interactive as possible. So I encourage you to send in your comments and raise your questions in the chat, and we will be running some polls in Slido. You can see the Slido tab to the right of the chat to get your thoughts and feedback on what we're discussing. And I'd like to start this session by getting you thinking. Today is our 16th episode of Mobility Talks, so in human terms, we are teenagers. And teenagers like to question established concepts. And while preparing this episode, I got the feeling that demand-responsive transport, or DRT, as it's come to be known, does not quite capture the full breadth of what is being addressed. It's more than just transport responding to a demand. And although acronyms can be helpful to make a concept manageable in terms of language, they do also run the risk of oversimplifying or sometimes even minimizing the importance of an issue. And so my question to you is, if you could add a word to demand-responsive transport, either demand-responsive something transport, or maybe demand-responsive and something transport, what would it be? And obviously the premise of this question is to try and get a sense from you on what are your objectives when talking about demand-responsive transport? What kind of changes would you like to see with demand-responsive transport being rolled out? And who knows, maybe here today we create the new acronym for DRT. And while you think about that and send us your proposals, I can see that people are still thinking about it. Before we get into our panel debates, where we will be deep diving into policies, services, and recommendations for demand-responsive transport, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Rafał Stanecki. He is Policy Officer at DG Move in the European Commission, and he will be giving us an overview of the EU policy context for DRT, as well as highlight some of the ways in which the European level can help fund projects in this area. So, Rafał, welcome to the Mobility Talks. And a quick unmute, Rafał, yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Good afternoon to all the participants. Thank you for invitation. I'm happy to be here with you to present in 10 minutes why Commission is intervening in this transport area, what Commission is doing and how it is doing. So let me start with actually why Commission is intervening in this area. What is the problem? We have a problem with congestion in urban areas, with an estimated cost on 270 billion euros per year. Greenhouse gas emissions, 25% of these emissions, it makes 25% of the emissions. And road transport is responsible for 70% of these emissions. Next, air pollution, to which transport contributes leads to staggering 400,000 premature deaths in the EU per year, plus 120 million Europeans affected by harmful noise levels. Then we have a climate urgency. The climate target plan aims to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, and by 2050, Europe is to become first climate neutral continent. Next element is a very important one when we look at DRT, social inclusion and human well-being. The Principle 20 of the European Pillar of Social Rights considers transport, and it states that it is essential to all citizens, and all citizens have a right. It is important determinant of human well-being, especially for disadvantaged groups. The last element, digitalization as a tool, but also element of revolution which is going on. This is an enabler to attain sustainability goals, and a good example of EU initiative is creation of mobility data space, among other data spaces. Now, in this context, Directorate General for Mobility and Transport, DG Move, developed, came up with the strategy in December 2020 with three objectives to make European transport system more sustainable, smart, and resilient. In this strategy, there are 10 flagships. Two of them are very relevant to DRT. Flagship 3, making interurban and urban mobility more sustainable and healthy, and flagship 9, making mobility fair and just for all. It basically states that mobility evolution should not leave nobody behind. It should be affordable. It should allow mobility in rural and remote areas as well for people with reduced mobility. The element of the strategy is urban mobility framework. Also from last year, in this document, we confirm that we want people and goods to move in more sustainable way in our cities, to make easier rural and suburban commuters traveling to school, to work, and support cities in the role as essential transport hubs. As we talk about DRT, it seems to be a very adapted solution, in particular for rural areas. Rural areas are important in the European Union because of their size, number of population who live there, their potential human, economic, cultural, but also leisure and tourism. However, we have problems which are related to isolation of these areas, loss of cultural and economic dynamism, aging population, and dependence on individual transport, which means car. To reply to these challenges, European Commission came up with the long-term vision for rural areas. And there are 4 areas where Commission will act for stronger, more connected, resilient, more prosperous rural areas. And it states that the development of the rural areas is conditioned by being well connected with each other, with peri-urban and urban areas. It also underlines the need for better public transport services in rural areas. What concerns DRT in our work, this is a part of shared and collective mobility services of the urban mobility framework. It is innovative complement to public transport. It is important element to limit the emissions. What I showed you in the first slide, a challenge is enormous, and every little step is important. And the last point is social inclusion, gender equity, and rural mobility, very important social elements. Next slide is about money. So we have some money for different stages for research innovation, like Horizon Europe, and also deployment, all the other. Horizon Europe is a research innovation program for 7 years. In mobility area, there is 300 million plus 350 million for research innovation from the 100 climate neutral cities mission. Sorry for the long name. Then we have deployment programs with important budget like Digital Europe with 7.5 billion, focus to bring digital technology to businesses, citizens, public administrations. It will also found data spaces, very relevant for DRT solutions. Invest EU fund promotes investment in green growth, and it will trigger over 370 billion euros in the same 7-year period. This recovery and resilience plans, so-called post-COVID fund, there is 62 billion, and the climate action is the sustainable mobility makes part of the climate action. So it means that 14% of the money in national plans should be allocated to sustainable mobility. I can also mention European Regional Development Fund, Cohesion Fund, where 8% of the national ERDF resources must be allocated to sustainable urban development, and the Interreg Europe at 380 million euros, where one of the topic covered is sustainable mobility. So a lot of money, and why there is a lot of money? Because Europe wants to decarbonize, and investing in sustainable urban transport is a way to decarbonize. That's why you can a lot of interesting projects can be financed with this money. And the last slide is what we have financed with there was Smarta 1 and Smarta 2 projects on focus on rural mobility. Smarta 3 is in the process of being selected. It will focus more on sustainable mobility for sustainable tourism, as well as network of municipalities, which I mentioned in the long-term vision. We want rural municipalities to talk to each other, to define their needs, and to set up the best working tools. We are here in the soft law. We can give guidelines and we can give advice, and this is the best way to do it when you listen to what is needed. There was a very interesting project, Mamba, which was focused on shared mobility and DRT solution in the Baltic region, in countries in the Baltic region. And to mention two projects without names, because they are still in the selection process and signing the agreements with funds from the Smart Cities mission. But there will be a DRT and shared mobility aspect in these projects. That was it from my side. I hope I was quick enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafał, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. You will stay with us, I hope, because I would like you also to reflect on some of the comments that we will be hearing throughout our debate session now with the panel. So I will definitely bring you in a little bit later, Rafał. So, we'll be seeing you again.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So with that overview of the EU policy landscape and some funding opportunities available to DRT, let's now go into the discussion. I would like to invite our three panelists today. We have Lisa Grace. She is Chief Marketing Officer at Nemi, a startup providing a software solution that enables flexible bus services. So welcome, Lisa. We have Lucia Cristea. She is Managing Director of European Integrated Projects, which is a consultancy she founded in 2007, and she's been working in the field of mobility for more than 35 years. Lucia, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Hello.
And Miloš Mladenovic, Assistant Professor in Transportation Engineering at Aalto University, and his current research interests are varied. They include assessing emerging mobility technologies, developing decision support methods, and many others. Miloš, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
So before we get started, let's have a quick look at the results of this poll, this disruptive DRT acronym poll. And I think what we can see here in the different answers in the word cloud, we have sustainable in the middle, but we also have concepts like inclusive, accessible, adaptive, public as well, I see, collective. So it seems that there is a little more to DRT than DRT. So what I'd like to start with is the actual concept and philosophy behind DRT. What we see in urban mobility is two different things. On the one hand, you have public transport, which is fixed. And on the other hand, you have a lot of options that seek to make it easier for the individual to move around the city, preferably without his or her car. So according to you, what is demand responsive transport all about? Is it a way of getting public transport closer to all users? Or is demand responsive transport a way of empowering users in their mobility options? Lisa, can I get a first call from you?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, John Paul, for that introduction. A pleasure to be here today sharing this virtual roundtable. So yeah, from our perspective, it's really about getting citizens back on the mobility grid. Okay, so for us, it's about choice and independence. And whilst it's true, as John Paul said, that there are certain areas where DRT can be about getting people out of their cars and encouraging them to use, well, to leave their personal vehicle, I think fundamentally, actually, it's about levelling up and about saying, let's try to create the same level of quality, reliable, flexible public transport that we see in urban areas, but in rural areas.
Okay, brilliant. Lucia.
Well, I'll refer to your first question. I think the answer could be yes or no, because if you have a very good DRT system, you can link it very well with a public transport, let's say, network. But sometimes the DRT is a necessity, and then comes from the community, and therefore it reflects the needs of a certain community. So it's very important for that particular community to shape this particular mobility solution that feeds their need.
So we have this sense of leveling up and meeting the need of community. So I hear that DRT is a lot about getting people who might be excluded from mobility into a mobility option. Miloš, what about your views then?
Yeah, I would definitely underline also that important point. Rafael was also talking about that. This question of transport poverty is quite serious overall, or poverties, better say, different kinds of challenges that different users are facing. So there is definitely that angle on kind of on the level of individual users. But of course, on the larger scale, we have to think about DRT as an important component in a different mobility ecosystem that we should have in not so very far future. Yeah, we have these targets that are quite soon, 2030, 2050. So DRT is in a sense also part of that transformation away from car-dependent transport systems that are catering only for some people and also come with great negative consequences.
Okay, so definitely there's a lot more to this than simply responding to a demand. I mean, sometimes it's even about creating a service in areas where maybe the demand hasn't been completely expressed or formulated yet. So I'd be definitely interested to hear a little bit further about that. In the report released today, we see that DRT is also nothing new. There is in fact a graphic that we can show, which shows how far back certain DRT services have come from. We have all the way from the 1970s. So there hasn't been a lot of development. It would be a graphic. It would be the graphic, you know, the next one. It started in the 1970s, but there was a bit of a gap, and then we see sort of an emergence in the year 2000, and then again a bit of a slow curve around 2006. Could we put up? Yeah, that's the one. Thanks. And then towards the end, a bit of an extra push again. So it's nothing new, but it seems also that there are some DRT services that seem to be failing. Again, I'd like to get your perspective on this. Maybe Lucia first. What are then some of these success factors and failure factors in why these DRT services haven't taken off?
I'll start with a reflection on what you said. DRT is not new, and I remember when I started in my profession, it was called dial ride or something like this. You know, we tried to collect these English terms, you know, into our own language and try to find a way. You know, it's in Italian it's pronto bus or something like this. You know, so each country tries to find a way to let's say express the meaning of and what the artist should do. I think the failure of it is, in my opinion, is that it doesn't address correctly the needs of a community. You know, sometimes the technical aspects could be put in place, you know, that maybe there are some resources to put in place a system, but doesn't reflect very well or doesn't address very well the needs of a community. And I think this is the gap between the technicians and those that are really need a system. Sometimes it's not necessary to say to think that somebody needs to go from A to B, from a village to a doctor somewhere in a city. It's not enough. But sometimes it's necessary to go from a village to meet another friend somewhere else. So you not understand the particular needs of a community, when and why they need to move, then you can't construct a system. And I refer what Rafa mentioned earlier. It's so important, the social component. If you do not understand the structure of the community, you will leave people behind. So my suggestion, do a step backwards, understand the community, what are their mindset, values, and what triggers that community to exist, and try not to isolate it by offering a service that may be of no use.
Lisa, maybe a reaction from you on some of the success or failure factors of past DRT, and in your software solution, how do you address then this aspect of understanding the community needs?
Yeah, well, actually, before we get into that, one thing I would like to point out is that the early DRTs that we saw in the 1970s were actually mainly in the UK and the US, and were actually paratransit. Okay, so there were specific services launched for people with mobility, with reduced mobility. Okay, and I think whilst there have been many failures, there have also been some successes, and many of those niche services launched in the 1970s actually were successful, because although they were extremely costly, they were less costly than an individual taxi or health authority vehicles, or ambulance. And I think that's probably still relevant today. So I don't want to get my NHS flag out, but we do see a need to kind of reduce the burden on public health authority vehicles and ambulances, etc. So I do still see that relevant today, and I know that many of those projects were successful. Whilst it is true that there have been many failures, I would agree with Lucia. In terms, one of the issues is that apart from the cost structure, okay, that's a whole different issue in terms of people being over ambitious in terms of flexibility and complexity of DRT services, and actually not being aware of just how big a fleet you need to cover all those services. But as Lucia said, actually there's an awful lot of legwork that goes in behind implementing a successful DRT. You really need to study, who your users are going to be, how the service is going to be organised, etc. And I think in terms of operators, public transport authorities, there's a whole different skill set that's required as well. So, it's not just about putting a fixed line public transport bus service on demand. There's an awful lot more that goes into it. So I think to a certain extent that's overlooked and can be an aspect of failure. And moving on to technology and how we feel technology has kind of come into play. I would say the main difference between the early DRTs and the current DRTs would be the reliability, the predictability and the transparency that technology platforms allow. Okay, so there are still on-demand transport services offered whereby you will call up, a reservation will be made by a back office. That has its costs, but it also doesn't allow to perhaps, open up new use cases and capture new users. For example, new use cases that we've seen more recently are corporate mobility, school mobility, different shuttle services, etc. So I think it's allowed us to kind of open up from what were the origins of paratransit and now look to apply this to kind of different user groups. And I would come back and say that I think that reliability and predictability of actually having, knowing when my exact pickup time is going to be, being able to see the actual bus location on my app gives me increased confidence. And if we know that users of public transport are primarily women, older people, adolescents, that level of reliability and that level of security, I suppose, is a real key driver to increase usership of such services.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, you introduced the notion of DRT services applying to different user groups over time, and that can also help to explain or better understand their evolution. And then the role of technology probably in the last, well, definitely in this century and probably even more so in the last decade. Milos, also your reflections then on the success and failures in the past to look better towards the future.
Yeah, so I would definitely underline all these aspects that Lisa and Lucia mentioned. There's a lot there about service design, kind of understanding different user groups. If I would add a keyword that is at least emerging in my mind, community responsive transport, yeah, as opposed to demand responsive transport would be one. But besides, so these for me are more sort of from the perspective of the service design, yeah. But if you think about also sort of more top-down factors, it's very, very important to understand kind of stakeholders in the governance space, yeah, in the ecosystem that you usually have. We know that there are usually multiple, at least a handful of different stakeholders responsible for transport in cities, and these lessons actually go even beyond, or they go back into the past even before that map there. Yeah, so there is the kind of the forgotten history of shared mobility is the very early 20th century, when people started to, of course, buy private cars, and then they soon enough realized that that's a very costly investment. So they started offering rides, yeah, informal rides to people. In the States, they used to call them also nickel rides, yeah. So you would pay a nickel to take a ride. There was no app, there was no phone. You would have to sort of talk to people and meet up at certain places and so on. Some kind of a semi-flexible DRT was back then. And unfortunately, that at that point in time, it was actually the public transport companies who were kind of threatened, or they felt threatened by this service, and they were largely responsible for also sort of shutting it down. Yeah. Which, in a sense, maybe we have missed a historical opportunity back then to kind of develop a very different ecosystem of kind of shared semi-flexible, flexible mobility. So I think public transport operators and kind of agencies overall are definitely still an important stakeholder in this network, beyond many other, of course. Yeah. So that aspect of governance stakeholders, I would say it's quite important in my mind, on top of the service design.
And maybe, Milos, just to go a little bit further on what you're saying, and to give a specific example, because I understand you've also been involved in Helsinki. Could you just give us a sense, top line, you know, success and failure factors of the DRT project in Helsinki?
Well, the one line is, if you have a very good algorithm, it doesn't mean you have a DRT service. Yeah. So sort of it really depends on where do you start solving sort of your problems overall. And that's partly what we have also seen in the case of Kutsu Plus. There was a lot of sort of dynamics on the policy making level that weren't necessarily rational, if you would say. Yeah. So they weren't really kind of trying to understand the bigger value that this service is offering. There was a lot of focus on direct costs and benefits, or just costs, let's say, even more in that particular moment. Sort of, if you would kind of understand more the larger value that this kind of a service has, and what kind of role does it have over time in changing the mobility ecosystem, then you would evaluate the service very differently from that kind of policy perspective.
Okay, and Lucia, then also maybe a reflection on more specific projects that you've been involved in. Maybe one, explaining us roughly the context and a top line success failure factor in your project.
Well, I have been involved in public transport, let's say, projects supporting DRT systems in the past, and I remember now the success of the Pronto bus near Perugia, you know, the area where I live at this moment, and this was very interesting from my point of view, because coming back what Milos said, the project wasn't triggered by the transport, let's say, or the public transport authority or the public transport operator, or even the community. It was triggered by the land use planners, because they realized that some communities are absolutely, let's say, isolated, and the people could not have access to jobs, to schools, to different type of services, you know. Therefore, it was necessary to have a sort of flexibility system, you know, transport to offer them. But I personally studied a bit more the shared mobility in the context of SMARTA project that Rafael mentioned earlier. I was very proud to be part of this project, and we looked across Europe and beyond to understand what is the rural mobility like, you know, and what is the situation. Is there any operational framework? It is any legal framework for operating a shared mobility system in rural areas? And the answer is majority of the countries don't have this formal let's say, framework for creating this type of system, or nurturing this type of system, or supporting this type of system. And I think this is it was a trigger for some recommendations to to look more deeply how we can start, like Milo said, how we can start bringing around the table those that they can, let's say, create a system that fits everybody's expectations. And I think here it is a bit more work, and this is why I'm very happy that the European Commission, could roll out this SMARTA program that it was extremely successful in my opinion. And the fact that it is more and more an interest to rural mobility, not as an afterthought, but as a central thought about how we can empower the communities, sometimes in remote areas, it's extremely important. So don't forget that rural communities are the lungs of the cities. Yeah, rural areas are the lungs of the cities, and it's very important for us all to invest in these rural communities. And transport is, in my opinion, the major, let's say, facilitator or enabler for this.
And here we're really talking about a rethinking of public transport, extending into areas where it currently doesn't have a lot of service. So Lisa, on the one hand, we hear that the algorithm doesn't make it all. It needs to somehow fit also with a system, with an ecosystem, with a community. But you also have to try and convince public transport authorities about the value of going in this direction. So can you also give us your reflections on some success, failure factors, and maybe specific projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. So I would like to talk about one of our services, one of our Nemi services that we have running in the north of Catalonia, in a very rural area called La Garrocha. If you haven't been there, you should. It's absolutely beautiful. But that's my second point, in fact. So the success factors for us, this was a service launched in the summer 2021, launched to connect a rural population of very small villages between 200 and 300 people to a larger urban centre, about 30,000. So for us, it was about creating the first and the last mile. Okay, it was an area that didn't previously have any public transport of any way, shape, or form. So it was a new service launched with the app, and given the profile of the people who live in the area, we were slightly concerned at the beginning, but this in fact has been one of our star services, a huge success, mainly because what we're doing is we've got small vehicles. We're not trying to fill up a 50-seater bus. We've got minibuses that are running around frequently. Okay, that also creates for a closer, more community kind of service, a bit like what Milo said earlier about that feeling of kind of travelling together, which I think there's an awful lot to be said about that. And being able to aggregate a decent number of people on each departure. Okay, so if you've got minibuses of, I don't know, maybe 9, 10, 12, 16 seaters, that's more realistic. I also agree with what you just said, John Paul. It's about rethinking. So it's not about just putting something fixed on demand. In this case, it was a rethink from the very, very beginning. And this area was interesting because it also doubles up as a tourist destination. So Rafa was talking earlier about rural tourism and how can we attract and manage perhaps a sustainable tourist destination and make it a whole sustainable experience, if you will. So this particular area has a whole range of different rivers and waterfalls. As I said, it is beautiful. That's La Garrocha in the north of Catalonia. And this service we actually, this summer, so we launched a service to run at the weekends as well, okay, to kind of capture that new market. So that would be one of our success stories from here, quite close to home in Barcelona.
Okay, thanks. And as you're talking about the service, I'd like to give a quick poll. We can show it. We can show it now to the audience. But I will be asking you the same question. What is the most important aspect of an attractive DRT service? You can only have one option. Is it its flexibility, that the service picks you up closest to your origin and drops you off closest to your destination? Is it its punctuality, that it picks you up and drops you off more or less at the right time? Or its affordability, that the price of the service is aligned with typical fares in public transport. So I'm going to ask the same question, quick fire. Let's start with Milos.
I would go with punctuality, because in terms of flexibility, at least, we have seen also the case with Kutsu Plus, stations or stops were fairly well distributed across space. So they were using the existing public transport stops that are quite dense, and then also these kind of virtual new stops in other places. While waiting in Finnish winter, minus 20, 1 minute doesn't feel the same as in Barcelona. So for me, punctuality would be then very important.
Okay, punctuality. We might see some cultural differences as well emerge here. Lucia, what would be your option?
Well, I'm tempted to say reliability, because this is, if you have a system, you want to be reliable, to go there, but at the same time, it has to be flexible, talking about rural areas that have so many particularities. So I'm torn between the two, so it has to be flexible, but at the same time, it has to be reliable. And saying what Milos mentioned, sometimes in rural areas, the infrastructure for transport is not so well developed. So I think a combination between two, if you allow me.
It's obviously not an easy one to pick one. Lisa.
Yeah, I'm also going for punctuality for pretty much similar reasons to Milos, in that DRT routes in their design have a denser, the higher density of bus stops, but also because we know that that reliability and predictability are key drivers. Okay, they're key drivers, like I said before, to confidence, and key drivers to a healthy uptake of a DRT service.
Okay. Brilliant. So I think that gives an interesting picture also on the service, and the quality of the service will influence on the uptake by users, but probably also by public authorities. But understanding the users is also important in developing demand-responsive transport services. And in the report published today by EIT Urban Mobility, I noticed a specific project carried out in Coimbra based on a local DRT service called Sit Flexi. And maybe we can just show up the graphic that just captures an element that I would like you to comment on. What we see on the one hand in this project in Coimbra in Portugal is that the age of users was, predominantly above 66 years old. So I think it's about 2/3 were 66-year-old or above. And the motive for using this service was to get to a healthcare service, a healthcare destination, which predominantly, again, 70%. So I just think that's also quite interesting to start understanding the kind of uses. And we spoke about the historical uses and how they've developed over time. But maybe as a first comment from Milos, is this the kind of user base that you would see as being, the most interested in getting a DRT service developed? Or do you feel that actually this is a very specific example and doesn't have so much echo?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely describing as one important persona, kind of in terms of user or service design. We have to think in terms of personas, different sort of, in a sense, positively stereotypical users that you have, and I think this is an important persona for a DRT service. This sort of elderly person that is most likely traveling to healthcare services and so on. In terms of Finland, for example, we have, in a sense, solved that problem before DRT, because through legislation and other acts, you can hire a taxi, even to kind of go, and then you will be refunded for that trip, and so on. So in any case, this is still an important persona overall, I would say. But then we have to think about other personas, most likely thinking about kind of not necessarily commuting trips, but let's say other types of trips that are important for DRT are social and recreational trips. And I think that's the ones that are kind of really shaping the way people change their habits. Most likely they also involve kind of middle-aged people or sort of parents and children, as kind of one additional group over there, which also kind of brings us back to this previous point on what kind of stakeholders we should be thinking about collaborating. So this is not just about transport or land use, is of course a big part of that, but also this sort of, education, healthcare stakeholders are quite important in that same kind of service design challenge.
And Lisa, then maybe to get again a sense of this accessibility, because if there is such a population that is using this kind of service, do you also then have to think about the way they're accessing this service? Maybe this population would be less interested in this, highly responsive app-based kind of system. They might still prefer, a more traditional way of booking a trip or something like that. Can you comment on that? I mean, do you get resistance on the kind of application that is used by users?
Yeah, I mean, the Nemi service is all available for booking on a hand-based app, but also by telephone as well. But to be honest, there isn't a huge amount of correlation between age and the type of booking. Okay, so I think actually one of the main drivers in terms of telephone booking is those areas where there is very poor internet connection. Okay, because if you book on the app, you will then get the updates via the app, and if you don't have a good 4 or 5G connection, you won't get the updates. There's, in terms of who's using the service and the method of booking, I agree to a certain extent in that for people who are elderly or are suffering a technology gap or lack of technology skills, that could be an issue. But I think looking towards the future, we have to remember that as smartphones become mainstream and for the over 65, so just think about, I don't know, we were talking earlier, 2040 isn't that far away. And for those of us who are in our mid-40s now, we're going to be in the 65 plus age group, right? So, and these things aren't so far away. So I think that would be an excellent way to keep costs down, because of course, when you have a DRT system, you have a call center, obviously you've got an extra party there in terms of dynamics of partnering and working together, but also it's very costly. So in terms of the app being the main way of booking, would be the way forward, just in terms of future projections. And those future projections are pretty easy to do. We've all got population pyramids. We all know what the Asian we all know what's coming, if you see what I mean. So there are no surprises there. And I think it's just a case of creating accessible applications that everybody is comfortable using. Okay, so accessible. So here we're talking about older people, but accessible also means people who may be technology challenged, who aren't in that particular age group. Okay, so being inclusive and accessible in the widest sense of the word. Yeah.
Okay, no, I think that's fair. I mean, probably the elderly population will evolve with technology. Will always be, a bit delayed, because the younger population will always be using things that we won't have heard of. But indeed, there will be a shift. Lucia, in this context of users, and you spoke a lot about the lungs of the city being in the rural areas. How does that then translate as users of those services?
Well, I'm trying to capitalize a bit of what Lisa said and touched upon Milos and what discussed earlier by Rafal. I think the population is aging in the rural areas, and this is one of the major factors that we have to take into account. It's predominantly in rural areas because it is a double effect of, let's say, of getting out of the rural area. So therefore, it is the effect of aging of the population is much more visible in these areas. But I think the structure of a rural area is changed nowadays. And especially after COVID, we can observe some changes. We have locals, those ones that are the backbone of the communities, those ones that are producing let's say the goods in the rural area. They are living day by day there and so on. So they have their particular needs. Sometimes they use a car indeed because they don't have any other access, or in case that they are in an let's say higher age group, they are reliant on somebody else. They rely on others, and therefore they may need this type of systems, to take them to the hospital or in other services that they may need. There are other people that are coming as visitors, in weekends, and they are coming with their urban mindset and urban expectation, to use a bike, to use I forgot now the term of that one. And this is totally different aspect. It is the tourists, that are coming for visitor, they like to enjoy this one. And there are some of them are coming back to the rural areas. They are from where they left, because they realize the quality of the life is there in rural areas rather than urban areas where they made a life. So therefore, understanding all these characteristics of those ones that are forming nowadays the rural communities, I think it's very important to understand what pressure they may put, for a type of service. Yeah, so there are trapped users, like we see probably in the case of Coimbra, where are those ones that are in an age group that they can't afford anything else. Maybe they don't have family, they don't have neighbors, so they can rely on this type of services. I live in deep rural areas, and there are some persons when the post office it doesn't exist anymore, the service, the doctor is not anymore, so they rely on everybody else to take them a ride to the nearest city or near town to take the pension. This is unacceptable in this century. So I think this type of things we have to, let's say, put a new perspective, try to understand. And as we come back always to those ones that have to be around the table, as communities, as those ones that are generating, let's say, the interest for the community per se to shape a mobility system or a mobility service that is needed for them. Urban mindset may be a bit tricky, but for planning, but I think concentrate on having this new, let's say, approach for planning for rural areas.
I really understand this element of social justice and how demand responsive transport can lead to a type of public transport that is more adapted to certain very specific uses. So I think we get that perspective. I'd like to just also try and get you to think about what demand responsive transport can do as public transport, in also maybe offering other types of ways of traveling around, cities or peri-urban or rural areas even. But beyond the question of social justice, maybe there are other objectives that could be sought. I'm thinking, for instance, nighttime services, possibly, or very specific types of services that lead, groups of people from one place to a very specific destination. Could be, we see that, let's say, in going to the airport, or I'm also thinking of, specific vehicles that could be adapted maybe to, I don't know, people pushing prams or certain types of elements like that. Do you think there's a role for demand responsive transport in this area as well? Or should it really be considered as something that corresponds to a social policy for public transport? Milos first.
Yeah, so I think there is also this bigger question of transformation away from car dependent mobility systems. So one simple example would be, we go back to the question of habits. What kind of mobility habits we have every day? How do we move around? Really shapes our well-being. Yeah, so we're not just talking about like physical health. Exactly, because we're kind of now exposed to much more sedentary lifestyles than ever before in history. Yeah. So recently there was some data from Finland sort of longitudinal data showing how Finns are less and less active over years, yeah, and that's definitely affecting. So what we also know is that we need to think about these sort of active lifestyles, and how do you create an active lifestyle? It's not about going to the gym 3 times a week and then the rest of the week just being, sitting on your couch and sitting in your car and sitting in your office and so on, but it's part of this sort of everyday short bursts of activity, yeah, walking to this stop and walking to that stop and then walking in between and sort of. So if DRT can also shape or help us shape a little bit these kind of new ways of lifestyle as well, that are also not just, we will also know that this, again, it's not just about physical activity, but it's also mental, yeah, well-being. Yeah, we have seen what happened with COVID as well. Just the very fact that you're not interacting with people in public space affects us. I mean, we're social beings at the end of the day. So I would also maybe think about that perspective of just like active lifestyle or a good well-being overall. Yeah.
Yeah. And Lisa as well, on expanding this user base. I mean, do you see that as a goal, that more and more users could actually be using demand responsive transport system within public transport, or do you see that as still a relatively limited group of people?
I think that so you're referring to whether demand responsive transport would be a niche product, or would it have the potential to?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that the idea would be to have demand responsive transport working together with the existing public transport networks, right? So we're not going to replace something, we're going to complement it. I also kind of believe in this ideological situation whereby we don't really have niche services for, I don't know, perhaps for elderly people, or whereby a service is just a service taking people from A to B. It doesn't have to be specific. Do you know what I mean? So it could be the end of kind of paratransit services, and say, okay, well, this vehicle is going from A to D via B and C. Anybody can jump on that vehicle. It doesn't have to be specifically for this niche market. Okay, so that's obviously another kind of take on all this. But for me, it's about opening up almost like a new decision tree of mobility options. And Milos mentioned before about giving people the option for active mobility. Perhaps introducing the idea of micro incentives to get people to walk to another bus stop to have a more of an active approach to mobility. But I think there always needs to be a safety net for those people who aren't able to enjoy active mobility. Okay, so if we're talking about, we know distances are longer in rural areas. We know that obviously in terms of the traditional rural population being older, obviously that is changing, as Lucia said. But I think for us it's about opening up mobility choices, and also capturing new users. Why not? Why not try to capture new users, but not looking to replace what's already there, looking to kind of work together and to complement, almost to feed into what's already there, to make these corridors that kind of feed in to transport hubs that then can take people to where they want to go on to, and not just about securing educational and work opportunities, but also obviously thinking about healthcare, but thinking about leisure opportunities as well, that we know that having social interaction and being independent, like giving mobility back to people and independence, and not being in this, as Lucia said, this absolute unacceptable situation whereby you have to rely on somebody else to get you to essential services. And those people often being squeezed, perhaps with elderly parents and children, so you're kind of in the middle and squeezed in this kind of, it's almost like a mobility nightmare. No, when you don't have time to take care of those people who depend on you. Well, perhaps those people need to be empowered to be made more independent mobility-wise.
And maybe in terms of scope, a place where a lot can still be done and imagined and created is actually in the peripheral rural areas around, because in a city center which is already highly networked, it's hard to imagine a huge expansion, let's say, of demand responsive transport in that sense. But in rural areas, one can imagine that could become a real mainstream public transport offer. And I'd like to just then get a perspective from Lucia on that. I mean, do you think that's a realistic proposal?
It is. I can say sometimes in rural areas, having access to transport is a matter of life or death. I don't want to be strong on this one, but this is the truth in certain areas. So we have to be aware about it. But I want to be very positive, because nowadays we are so creative, and there are, with the support of the technology, but also with the support of, let's say, exactly networking, creative networking, we can develop new mobility innovations. And these new mobility innovations for rural areas can transform an issue to an opportunity. Let's take the advantage at this moment. We are in a crucial situation, a crucial moment, like Milos mentioned earlier. We have to take advantage of this moment that we are living at this moment. We live at this moment, and then we have to take this advantage to transform an issue and an opportunity, taking into account the social diversity in rural areas. Don't forget that to achieve something like this is very important to align, to integrate different policies at a rural level. Sometimes we forget that rural areas have a huge economic potential, and we sometimes look at areas around cities or near the cities to invest a lot. But nowadays, the rural areas can have a huge potential for investing, and they can generate a lot of interest. By generating this interest, it's a win-win situation. Cities will benefit, but also the rural communities will benefit. And I think creating a new strategies for rural areas, integrating different policies, not only at transport, not only health, not only tourism, any type of policies that supports the development of that rural area, I think it's crucial to do it. I think it is the moment, and let's take advantage of that moment. As we say we said in Smarta, time to act.
Okay, brilliant. Well, let's hear what you think out there in the audience. We can put up the last poll. What do you think are the most likely outcomes for demand responsive transport? Will it hold the potential to completely transform the way public transport is organized? We can put up the Slido. It can provide complementary services for public transport. It will fulfill niche services for specific users within public transport. It can help connect urban, peri-urban, and rural areas. It will develop alternative and competing services to public transport, or it will not develop at all. You have up to three options that you can pick. And we'll be looking at the results a little bit later. And I would like then to just go back as a final question, top line answer from our three panelists. So we're talking about recommendations for successful deployment of demand responsive transport. And I would like you to think about one each, and that you can just throw at us to really say, this is something you absolutely have to think about when you're deploying a demand responsive transport service. So can I start with Milos first?
Yeah, I don't like that academics are recommending to practitioners what they should be doing, but I'll still go ahead and going back to that larger question of transformation of urban mobility systems in particular. And we mentioned also this avoid, shift, improve framework that is quite essential to be implemented in the following years and decades. I would say that this is about DRT, but it's very much also about other mobility policies. So, and the one policy that we have been largely forgetting about, even if it was right in front of our nose for a very long time, is parking policy. Yeah. So if we kind of want people to change their habits, and we want to sort of change the very trajectory of the mobility system that we're having, if you have to have these sort of innovations like DRT, but you also have to steer the urban mobility system in a different direction, and quite effective policy that all cities have at their disposal is a very comprehensive parking policy.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Milos, for having shared your views on this. Lucia, your key recommendation.
Well, bring justice to rural areas, through transport. I think it's a matter, sometimes the transport systems are appraised based on the economic effects, cost and benefits. Think about the social aspects that social benefits that a system like this will do it. So try to balance a bit this appraisal, and I think it in from a different perspective, put different lens, put rural mobility lens rather than urban lens, that usually the planners have at this moment.
Yeah, I think that message was received loud and clear, and the question of cost needs to be thought not just as economic but also social. I think we definitely got that message. So thank you so much, Lucia, for having been with us. And Lisa.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, let's face it, there's going to be, we're talking about rural areas, so there are going to be no new tram lines, no new light railways, no new metro systems going to be inaugurated. So if we're looking for a long-term solution to solve this mobility crisis that we've been talking about in rural areas, then the only solution really is the public transport bus service, and we need to approach that in a more smart, intelligent way. So from our perspective, it's about making the best use of the resources that you have, and saying, okay, what are my resources? A bus, a vehicle, and a driver. Okay, so how can I, without spending huge amounts of money on a new fleet or whatever? No. Take what you have and say, how can I make it work better for the community, creating optimal routes, using my existing vehicles, but having a service that actually works and solves the mobility issues for that group. Okay, so a frequent, flexible, decent public transport service that is kind of going around the houses, rather than one of these, I don't know, the typical rural bus that runs around 3 times a day and it's got one person on it. Taking a sensible, intelligent approach, almost, rewriting the script to a certain extent, extending the areas, etc. But, as Rafael said before, we're talking about 83% of the area of the European Union, so this isn't small for us. This is important, and for us it's fundamental in terms of us as a whole community.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa, for having raised all these issues with us. You can actually set up a DRT service just as an add-on to an existing system. It doesn't necessarily have to create something totally new. It just adapts something that exists and makes it more efficient. Thank you so much for having been with us and engaged in this panel.
So could I just say, sorry, just to interrupt, for those Spanish speakers in the audience, there is actually, and for people who are really interested in delving knee deep into DRT, we've got a online training course which is called Transport on Demand, run by the EIT, and it's available from the 2nd of November. Okay, so I wanted to mention that for those people in the audience who might be interested in signing up. So check that out.
Okay, and maybe we can leave a comment in the chat. I'm sure there are colleagues from EIT Urban Mobility who can raise that. Perfect. Thank you so much to all of you. And I would like to actually bring Rafael back on stage because he's been listening. And I don't know if you've picked up any of the comments that were made by some of the panelists. I mean, we spoke a lot about this social justice element that demand responsive transport can bring to public transport and public service. Is that an area in terms of policy that the European Commission or the European Union can support with?
Thank you, Jean-Paul. I was following the discussion with a lot of interest, and actually have one comment or 2 comments and a question to panelists if they wish to answer, if I'm not stealing your job, Jean-Paul. The comment is, we talk about people who don't have car or who cannot drive, it used to be the most horrible situation in life that one could imagine, not being able to drive. But we have the social phenomenon in the cities. People don't want to have cars. They can have. And I think it is also spreading to the peri-urban areas that people consciously don't drive the cars. So with some offers of DRT and public transport, shared mobility, this kind of attitude could more easily to find adepts. The second thing, maybe to an expert, in some of the studies, it was mentioned about cooperation with service providers to successful DRT. Were there any examples of, for example, when booking a visit to a doctor, veterinary, or hairdresser, getting immediately a solution for a DRT or shared mobility solution? Maybe one of the experts maybe could have something like this. And the last thing, as you mentioned, the commission is actually in the area of mobility has it's a soft law. We are not imposing in urban mobility any directives. It's also about sustainability, so the solutions should be as close as possible to the people concerned. So we are basically limit ourselves to guidelines, recommendations, and financing. Some projects or policy initiatives which go to the European objectives like decarbonization, emissions, digitalization. So interesting projects, ideas can find money in this area. I could only add one aspect, which is public service obligation, a bit social aspect of the shared mobility, where we also work on guidelines for the moment, so there is no directive, but on the right of citizens to have transport options. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rafał. I mean, it's we're a little bit tight on time, I'm afraid. So, but I think your points have been raised, and definitely there is that shift away from the car. But hopefully we can keep this discussion alive. This is only the beginning. The report was out today. This discussion happened, and I'm sure we'll have more opportunities in the future. So thank you so much, Rafał, for having been with us and listened, and hopefully it gives you good ideas for future policies. Nevertheless, even if it's soft. Brilliant. Thank you. So let's have then a quick look at our poll results. I will now reveal them. What do you think are the most likely outcomes for demand responsive transport? And I think the message on the rural and connecting the rural areas with the urban areas was received loud and clear. It's our #1 polled answer. And then we have second option, it can provide complementary services for public transport. So we're not looking necessarily at a revolution, but complementing and creating connections with the rural areas. So I think that's an interesting result for this discussion. So thank you so much also to the audience for having taken an active role here. And I would like now to hand over to Luis Puerto. He is the Director of Factory at EIT Urban Mobility, and he will be giving us his concluding remarks on today's session. Hi, Luis.
Hi, Jean-Paul. Thanks a lot. And thank you also all the panelists, Rafał, Lucia, Milos, and especially Lisa Grace from Nemi services who can sponsor this report and workshop series. Regarding the key takeaways of this mobility talk, I take with me 3 main concepts. One of them is ERT. First one is ERT is a niche service, not applicable as is anywhere, but with great societal value if it's deployed in, for instance, in transit deserts, or transit poverty strikes hard. It can really benefit social inclusion in communities, and it can have also great cost efficiency potential if it's deployed in the right conditions. Which brings me to the second takeaway, which is there is no one size fits all in DRT. It requires planning stage where all the local conditions have to be analyzed, the baseline, and also playing with the three main factors of URT design, which is cost, of course, but then reliability, schedule punctuality, and flexibility of bus stops, locations, routes. Also, so these factors in the end determine which is the service, the level of service that is going to be implemented. And actually, this is also bringing me to a third main conclusion, which is the wide and rich diversity of services that can be built with DRT. We can go from use cases that succeed in low density rural areas, but at the same time, it could succeed in low demand area situations like bus services in urban areas. So that these are just two examples, but it explains that with those factors that play in the service design, we can achieve many different goals and build very diverse services. But really, it's a really customizable service that brings the flexibility that many times fixed transit lines don't have. These are the main takeaways for me. Of course, there are others, of course, having like such expertise together also brings a lot of opportunities to deep dive even further. I just want to point out that this has been the seventh issue of our thought leadership activities at peri-urban mobility. So leadership is the activity where we bring together the key stakeholders in one particular subject, in this case, DRT. Typically, we bring together public-private actors, innovators, startups, academia, and research organizations to share knowledge, to network, to find new opportunities for cooperation. So please, you can see on the screen our contact details. Reach out to us if you want to get involved in our leadership activities. Any kind of contribution is welcome, so please reach out to us. And stay tuned for the upcoming releases. We are going to release a study on the 15-minute city and on urban air mobility deployment very soon, by mid-November, in our flagship event, which is the Tomorrow Mobility World Congress, that will happen in Barcelona, 15th and 17th November. So please be there, and we will also share new insights from our leadership activities. Thanks a lot, and back to you.